You can hear me, yes? Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Anand. And I want to say that in my statement for applying to grad school, I wrote that I wanted to do neural networks. And here I am at the Neural Networks conference not talking about neural networks. So I will, in the next slides, I will explain what are the differences and what are the similarities between random matrices and understanding neural networks and understanding manifolds in an unsupervised learning mode, which is the topic of this talk. And I'm going to start by talking about the motivation for me of this line of work is the understanding of scientific data and advancing scientific knowledge. And so there are two things that we have to keep in mind. First, that before machine learning existed, mathematics and sciences were in a very tight symbiosis. And so the mathematics was the language for laws of nature. But in addition, sciences had their own language in which they explain, where they use terms like temperature or concentrations or velocity and so on, which are not necessarily mathematical, but are part of the scientific language. And then there comes machine learning or data science, and suddenly we can get a lot more information from data, but this information is at a much lower level because it's done one distribution at a time, essentially. And so one of the, maybe the main focus of this talk is to take machine learning with scientific data and bring it back from one distribution at a time to something that is communicable as laws of nature. And it is incomplete. It is a step, I think, in the right direction, but it is incomplete in the sense that I'm not coming out and giving you laws of nature. What I'm doing is actually taking the scientist out of the job of having to visually check that machine learning has done its job. And I think this is the first connection with the aim of this workshop. A neural network is much higher dimensional. A neural network is trained in supervised mode, has inputs and outputs. Whereas here, data limits us, non-parametric rates limit us to small dimensions. And also, there's no input-output. What we are searching for is the structure of an entire distribution. That is like a simple way to describe unsupervised learning, be it clustering or manifold learning or even causality or graphical models. We are looking for the structure of a distribution, which is not exactly what neural networks do. However, the preoccupation is still to explain what we have learned in human understandable terms and to make sure that the results are artifact-free in the case of manifolds, hallucination-free in the case of AI, and that they are reproducible. And reproducibility is not a guarantee that they are correct or have no hallucination, but it's a first step towards doing scientific research with machine learning. So the first part of the talk, like the main part of the talk will be going from machine learning to scientific concepts, not an automated way, but semi-automated way. And the second part, which will be much shorter, if there is time, will be about bringing up more mathematical concepts into machine learning. So learning specifically with vector fields and harmonic functions. Okay, and so this is the contents, a lot about manifold coordinates with scientific meaning, and a little about learning different mathematical concepts and classes of objects. So coordinates with scientific meaning were basically the bread and butter of science. Of course, there is we all say, without prediction, if you can't predict in science, then it's not a science. But that's the litmus test of science. But we also have to have something that is much softer and smoother and less precise, which is explaining what's going on. And that's, as I said, in a high-level language, the language of a particular science. However, there is the intersection between the two. And let's start with this figure. This is the, how many of you know what this is? OK, this is a very famous plot from astronomy. This is a Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. And essentially, it ties the spectrum of stars. Of course, it's very simple. It's only in the spectrum in only 2 dimensions. with a single manifold. So it shows that basically the spectrum of stars can be described by some clusters, and the main cluster is what's called the principal sequence, which is a one-dimensional manifold. And this manifold is parameterized by the age of the star. Here is something from the history and geography of human genes, where the principal components of a large data set of human genes was mapped onto longitude and latitude, and it gave a picture that's highly interpretable, basically explaining the relative transformation of the genes, which actually follows or can be interpreted as a pattern of human migrations. So again, a seminal result of interpreting transforming coordinates, principal components, abstract coordinates, data-driven coordinates, into something that's humanly understandable with like big effect on their own sciences. And the third is also a seminal graph. It comes from molecular dynamic simulation. This is there's a peptide. And every atom having three-dimensional coordinates, the configuration of this peptide is in over 40 dimensions. Yes. However, and this is like, it's not low-dimensional anymore. Maybe not at the size of neural network, but it's high-dimensional. This can be described in a way that's meaningful to scientists by this two-dimensional mapping, where the coordinates are the psi and phi, the angles of rotation of various parts of the molecule with respect to the rest, relative rotations. Okay, and this is also, these are called Ramachandran plots, and also very popular and used in molecular dynamics. The difference is that while there is only one galaxy, and there is basically not so many sets of human genetic population, protein simulation and molecular dynamic simulations are being done all the time. So we want to be able to actually take the scientist out of the loop and interpret molecular dynamic simulation, so this is the next slide, in a way that's much faster than the time that it took to discover the mapping of the human genome on the coordinates. So my running example will be exactly this, understanding data from molecular dynamic simulation. And if there is time, I'm happy to explain why this is a great test, but not just because it helps theoretical chemists and computational chemists, but also because it actually it's a great challenge for people who do manifold learning. So this is an even smaller molecule, but just like the other one, has 3 units. And so there are 2 possible relative rotations along the skeleton. And this is a simulation that is actually, you can say it's synthetic data, but this synthetic data is extremely expensive. It's done on supercomputers. And so it's, the more information, the more knowledge you can extract from this data, the better you do for the scientist. So the original data, of course, makes no sense, even if we slice it in some way. But because this is such a simple molecule, simple pre-processing, like removing some degrees of freedom, shows that this data is actually a torus with noise, and where the density varies and the noise amplitude vary greatly. So these are densely sampled regions, and these are, and the middle ones are loosely sampled. And because it's a torus, we can immediately, and the scientists have already done this for this small molecule, connected one of the rotations with the yellow torsion. And you can see it here. This is the yellow torsion is the vertical generator of the torus, and the purple torsion is the horizontal generator of the torus. Make sense? So even though the data is high dimensional, it is described with error, with loss. It's a lossy compression into 2 coordinates, and we know what they are. They're the generator of the torus, and they are represented in the molecule by some physical quantities that we can measure in this case. I want to also show something about manifold learning here. There are differences between the raw data in, this is principal component space. Yes. And the manifold learned data, which doesn't use the principal component space. One is the data is much smoothed. So the noise is removed. So we better believe that that is noise. The second is that the data is distorted, and that's actually typical in manifold learning. We do not have an algorithm for isometric embedding, and you can ask me later what we can do instead. However, I'm going to always show distorted images of the molecular dynamic simulation, just to remind you that there's no isometry. We have to deal with it in whatever we do. Okay, and so the problem is this. My graduate students and many other graduate students before have actually plotted various torsions. There are more than 2 torsions in this molecule. Like any 4 atoms can generate a dihedral angle. That represents a rotation. So any 2 planes in the molecule that are supported on 4 atoms can give us a dihedral angle. And in fact, there are like, we can have 700 torsions here if we try all the possibilities, a very large number. So could we do this without asking a grad student to plot all the possible torsions? You can see why that's not practical. It's very slow. It may be that for another molecule, there's no single coordinate that is in higher dimension, human eye can't do it. Also, it may be that in other data sets, this is a really simple data set, the coordinates are really a combination of 2 torsions or of other quantities. So we can't actually assume that the generator is any way a special coordinate in this case. Yes? We want to do it for arbitrary manifolds where we don't have a special coordinate system. What we have, however, is the scientific language. And in the scientific language, we have the prior knowledge. And this is not a prior in the Bayesian sense. It's just in the sense that the coordinates have to be from this set of possible functions of the data, which in this case are all rotation angles. Okay. So we want to put together 2 things. Some coordinates obtained by machine learning from a data set, and I'm going to call them data-driven coordinates, and some scientific knowledge that says there should be a set of coordinates in this set, which is, I call a dictionary, that's an equally good coordinate system for this manifold. Okay, and if we find this, then basically what we do is we affect a change of coordinates. Yes. If this, we find a subset of the dictionary that gives us a coordinate change on this manifold, and it's actually another coordinate system on this manifold. However, this one is interpretable. And because we know this, and there are many advantages, one of them being that we can actually transmit it to somebody else. And instead of saying, hey, this is my embedding, we can say, oh, these are the 2 torsions. Did you find the same 2 torsions in your data set or in your experiment? And that is how scientists communicate. So the definition of explanation, because there are many definitions of explanation in machine learning, is to find manifold coordinates from a set of variables of interest, which express the scientific knowledge. And it works like this. The scientist proposes a dictionary. In parallel, from data, we obtain data-driven coordinates. And if it's not a manifold, you can think just as well as coordinates from principal components. It makes the problem simpler. And then we run an algorithm, a wrapper algorithm, you can say, which takes these 2 and obtains this subset of interpretable coordinates. Does this make sense? Yes?
So the parameter D is like is that assumed as input, or?
Yes, great question. So a manifold has an intrinsic dimension that is denoted by little d. And it's assumed that we know it, and that's actually a pretty important assumption. However, dimension estimation is statistically an easy problem, so we have to do that before. So we have to estimate 2 things for manifold embedding. This is not directly related to the talk. One is the embedding dimension, which is d or larger. For example, a torus is dimension 2, but it has to be embedded in 3 dimensions to be topologically correct. And then we have to also estimate the dimension d that gives us a coordinate system with these functions. And that's important. OK, so how do we do it? As I said, we want a change of variable between some functions, some given dictionary of variables, and the data-driven coordinates that we have obtained. Yes, and this is the function that's a change of variable. We assume that's smooth. So basically, we want a function with non-zero Jacobian, well-conditioned Jacobian that ties the 2. All right, but this is not so easy because, so it's something like a sparse regression. And we know a lot about sparse regression, but we know only about sparse linear regression, and this is a very nonlinear problem. And in fact, then the problem is not so much the nonlinearity, but the fact that we cannot assume any parametric form, we cannot assume any basis. And that's because the left-hand side, these depend on the algorithm. So if I change a little a parameter of the algorithm, I change completely the coordinates. Yes? So this is like in the assumption of manifold learning that there are many equivalent coordinate systems, and a different algorithm may give me a completely different coordinate system, and I cannot predict. I can't use any basis that's better than any other. Okay. And I can't assume anything like isometry, or that one of the blue functions corresponds exactly to one of the red functions. This has to be just something with a well-conditioned Jacobian and nothing more. Okay, so how do we do this? And the answer is actually very simple. In the interest of time, I'm not going to wait for suggestions. The idea is to basically go to gradients. So whenever function composition, if we go to the differentials, is linear composition of the differentials. Okay, so we go from something that's dimension 1, a scalar, dimension m, a set of scalar functions, to a set of vector functions, vectors in the tangent plane, and we want to regress these vector functions on these other vector functions, the gradients of the scientific functions, by some sparse linear regression. And we know how to do this. And in fact, this is just notation. So basically, the y variable is the gradients of the data-driven manifold. The x variables are the gradients of the dictionary function. And the coefficients beta are the gradients of the change of variable. Yeah. So at every point, we get a sparse linear system. However, notice that because this h is not linear, the betas will change from point to point. So we have one data point for every beta value. All right? So we can't actually get the betas in a way that's statistically consistent. However, we can get the subset S, because that has to be the same for each of these linear systems. Yes? So the main, like we have trivially a set of linear systems, but they are tied by this constraint that the subset, the support is the same for all of them. And again, very luckily, this maps directly to a problem that we know. It's called group lasso, which is a convex problem, which does sparse selection by groups. And by groups, I mean that there is a group of betas for each of the dictionary functions, and they have to be zeroed out simultaneously. And if we solve this problem, we are not going to use the betas, but we are going to use the support. Make sense?
So you don't actually estimate H directly. You're only estimating the gradient
Yes.
evaluation.
Yes. So I don't estimate H directly. I just estimate the functions.
Right.
Yes. And that is actually also nice because it means that if this torsion was torsion squared, I don't have to put two functions in the dictionary. One torsion stands for torsion squared, any monotonic transformation of the torsion. Yes. And that's nice. For torsions, I don't have any good example of why this could be squared. But if you think of a variable called temperature, in physics, it appears either as 1 over t, or logarithm of t, or e to the minus t. So it's important that we only put one variable, temperature, and take care of all the possible instances in which it can appear. OK. So I'm going to skip this, but what I want to say is that there is a little detail because we are working in, oops, this looks like an older version. Basically, in manifold setting, we have to be careful with the gradients. Essentially, essentially, we have to bring them to the same coordinate system and to the same space. And there is an operation of pullback that we are doing to do this. And I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. Yes. So these are graded. The red gradients are in ambient space. They have to be projected on the tangent space. The blue gradients are actually in another space, in the embedding space, and we have to pull them back. But we solved this problem. Okay. All right. So this is the algorithm. I'm going to just summarize what I said. Everything starts with estimating the tangent space because gradients live in tangent spaces. Then for the dictionary functions, we just project their ambient gradients on the tangent space, and that gives us the x variables. For the gradients of the embedding, we have to first project them on the tangent space out there in the embedding space, and then pull them back, and that's something that I skipped, but we can do it. And then after we have the inputs, we solve group lasso and obtain the support. And this is, again, the group lasso problem. What I did not say is related to the dimension. Group lasso has a lambda, parameter lambda, and we have to choose lambda. And remember, you can't do cross-validation. This is unsupervised learning. But what we can do is actually know enough to fix the lambda, because we know the intrinsic dimension of the manifold. As I said, we estimated before. And so we choose the lambda that gives us, in this case, 2 coordinates. Yeah. And this is an example. So this is the same manifold ethanol. And these are, if you look at the one that says combined, these are the norms of each group of beta, the ones that zero out. And of course, when lambda is 0, then all the betas are non-zero. And then as lambda grows, and this is logarithmic scale, the useless betas one by one go to 0 quite fast. We do binary search in lambda, so that's why we have so few points. Okay, and what is left is 2 coordinates, the dark blue and the light blue, and the light blue stands for orange, which actually survive the longest. So if dimension is 2, we are going to pick these 2, and interestingly enough, they correspond to the ones that we are actually expecting for scientific reasons. Moreover, in this case, and only in this case, there is a correspondence. So the pale blue coordinate corresponds to the vertical generator. And as we see, it's higher all over the place. And the dark blue corresponds to the 2 coordinates of the circle that supports the other generator of the torus. So this is a torus embedded in 3D, so we have 3 coordinates, but only 2 dimensions. Yes, and this is shown by basically the relative height. So this is what we expect to obtain, and now I'm going to talk about a little bit about the theory, and then I'm going to show some experiments that essentially say it works on all the molecules that we tried. So let's talk a little about the theory. How many minutes do I have? Out of 50? 22. OK. So give me some signals when I'm all right. So we want to know that this recovery, like we want to have some consistency result and some recovery results. And they have to be, part of them is when is actually S unique in function space? Yes. When is this recoverable at all? And we have a theorem that is much more detailed, but essentially says that that it should be a rank condition. If Fs is this set, it should be unique in the sense that we can't replace it with another set. Or that if we add any other function from the dictionary, we get a larger set. And that ensures uniqueness. This is based, is not trivially the inverse function theorem, but it's based on the intuition is the same, or the implicit function theorem. Okay. So now, if we have actually functionally independent dictionary, where this actually the special set is functionally independent, we don't care much about the others, then one can group lasso recover this. And here we have a theorem that's very similar to lasso recovery with incoherence conditions. And again, I can talk more about them, which actually also ensures recovery when the gradients are incoherent enough, which is essentially saying the Jacobian has to be well conditioned enough, and the other gradients have to be incoherent with the ones that we are recovering. Okay. And these are the actual theorems, if we want to look. Now, we can simplify, maybe you have already realized, that we can simplify this algorithm quite greatly, because this algorithm can work without an embedding. Yeah. Let me see. OK, so why it can work without an embedding? Because if one embedding, any embedding we use should give us the same coordinate with scientific meaning, because they are all equivalent up to a change of coordinates. Yes. So we don't even need to do the embedding, and that's actually very convenient because the embedding is an expensive step. If we just look at what functions in the dictionary can form a basis for the tangent space of the manifold. And that's sufficient. Because if we have a it's the same set that would actually parameterize any embedding. And because this is a simpler problem, it doesn't depend on any embedding algorithm, we can have end-to-end consistency conditions. Like from samples, from the assumptions on the independence of the data, and the assumptions over the sample size, we have high probability recovery conditions of the dictionary under the standard assumptions, the regular assumptions. Okay. And these are examples of, on the left are the simplest simple manifold lasso where you don't use the embedding. And on the right, I think there are results with using the embedding. What I want to stress are two things. First, P is the size of the dictionary. And it can be very large. So these are the number of total number of torsions for ethanol. Okay. The sample size is like 50, so it's tens of thousands to estimate the manifold, or to estimate the tangent plane locally. But the number of points for which you do group lasso doesn't have to be all the data set. It can be only enough data points to actually constrain the dictionary. Okay. And essentially, there's not much to say because the algorithm worked on every synthetic data set that we used in manifold in molecular dynamics, and we have some extra. I'm not showing them, but we did some synthetic results with experiments with increasing noise and increasing curvature, and it's robust up to where the noise and the curvature confused. Okay, so in summary, from a strictly technical point of view, we have a method to change nonlinear sparse regression into linear sparse regression in a completely, totally non-parametric way. We use this to obtain a coordinate change from some coordinates that are obtained by machine learning, principal components or manifold learning, into interpretable coordinates that are expressed in the languages of the domain. Okay, and because this is manifold learning, what it explains is the large-scale structure of the data. And large scale is, depends on our threshold for noise. That is also prior knowledge. But moreover, what's pretty important is that this is transmissible knowledge because it's in the language of the scientist, and we don't need to actually send the whole data to other scientists to compare or send the embeddings, which will not look the same. In fact, further down, you may see embeddings by other students or of the same data by other students, and they will not look the same. They will be distorted in various ways. So this is a way actually to communicate knowledge between the scientists. So we lifted the estimation algorithm to a level, to the level of proto-science. Yeah. What this is not. Well, it's nonlinear, non-parametric, basis-free, but it's also not symbolic regression. And I want to make the distinction because many groups in science now use symbolic regression for essentially the same problem. So how many of you are familiar with symbolic regression? Okay, so symbolic regression is an algorithm that takes data and a collection of atoms from which you can construct mathematical equations. So plus, minus, division, exponent, as I said, temperature, temperature squared, the sinus of temperature, or basically the functions, square, sinus, cosine, tangent, and so on, plus a bunch of variables, and tries to find an equation that fits the data. And there are two differences. One is that symbolic regression actually outputs an equation. We don't output an equation. You just output the variables themselves. Now, I will argue after this talk that if you have the variables, you can then do whatever you want to find the equation. The hard step is finding the variables. But we don't output an equation. And we also can only output a small set of variables. We can't output an expression that is higher than the intrinsic dimension of the data. However, because of this, our problem is convex and tractable. The dictionary is combinatorially smaller. And another thing that symbolic regression I don't think we have actually also consistency conditions. So I understand that are actually checkable in practice. Maybe not things related to the curvature of the manifold, but the Lasso recovery conditions are always checkable in practice. So we can check in practice that we satisfy the condition, and that we can expect uniqueness. So in some sense, this is perhaps more scientific than symbolic regression because it has fewer artifacts, fewer chances to go wrong. Moreover, there are many extensions. One of them is that no manifold is necessary. We can always match, like wherever a change of variable is reasonable, this method could be used or can be used. And in particular, anything related to PCA can be also used automatically. And we have also some other extensions. For instance, the obvious extension is that we have multiple manifolds, and we'd like to see if there is a coordinate system that works for all of them. Another important and not trivial question at all is to find functions that are not gradients, but are actually level sets, or tangents. And that is a much harder problem because it's in ambient space. Another problem that is very hard is the following. Is actually explaining a single manifold with finding all the functions that could explain a single manifold. And that seems like even easier than this, but it's not for reasons that I'm not going to go into. And why is this important? It's important because in many situations we see like a dynamical system. Like think of a person walking. Yes, there are several joint angles that actually could also all parameterize the walking. Left leg, right leg, you can imagine that. However, there are also joint angles like what I do with my hands or head that have nothing to do with walking, so there is a larger dictionary there. And walking maybe, or analyzing videos maybe doesn't need us because we have other ways of understanding those processes, but something like protein folding is also described this way. Several things have to happen simultaneously for the protein to hold. And scientists do not know. They can actually simulate protein folding, but there is another stage in which they try to understand what is it that causes the folding to happen. What varies during folding? And things are obvious, but lots of things vary during folding, but which ones are the ones that actually cause it and are important, essentially? And so that's something that we are trying to work on. OK, how many minutes? Because now I'm going to. We have time for questions too, right? OK, so I'll try to be as quick as possible. Learning with flows and vector fields. So this is not something that is trying to explain a manifold, but basically to lift machine learning to higher level mathematical concepts, which are, for example, the first order 1 Laplacian of a manifold. And the order 1 Laplacian of a manifold gives us a basis for vector fields. Just like the standard Laplacian, its eigenfunctions are a basis for the scalar function of the manifold, the 1 Laplacian gives us a basis for all the vector fields on the manifold. Okay. And in particular, its decomposition gives us, so vector fields of manifolds can be of 3 kinds. I'll talk about them in a moment. They're more complex than scalar functions. And the harmonic vector fields are responsible for the loops in the manifold. So the dimension of the harmonic space, that's the null space of L1 Laplacian, is exactly the dimension of the loop space of the manifold. So it would be 2 for this torus. OK? So with this quick introduction, I'm going to go quickly about what we can do mathematically and what we can do, what applications this opens up. So, as I said, Laplacians are central to manifold learning. They do the smoothing, they do regularization, they do clustering, and they help us understand the manifolds. And higher order Laplacians capture higher order geometry of the manifold and also capture higher order topologies, higher dimensional topology as well. So technically, we are going to estimate the first order Laplacian from data with a consistency proof. And then we are going to show examples of smoothing, basically doing all the things that were done before, but now with vector fields. And they're more complex. Some of them, especially the manifold prime decomposition, is much more complex than spectral clustering, even though this is the analog of spectral clustering in vector field space. So what is this 1 Laplacian? we start with samples from a manifold. And if you have ever done manifold or Laplacian estimation, you know that from these samples, we create a graph, a weighted graph, and from that we estimate a Laplacian by some operations on the graph like normalizations. To estimate the order 1 Laplacian, we have to go to what's a simplicial complex, where on top of a hypergraph, essentially, where we also include triangles if their edges are short. And this is called, we call it the Vietoris-Rips complex. If you know TDA, then come back and talk about, to me, it's not exactly it, but it's a simple way to present it. So we create this complex, and this is, again, we have to put weights on the triangles, on the edges, and on the nodes. And all this, except for the weights, was very well known before. In fact, all the formulas are known. The only contribution we have, and that hadn't been done before, is how to choose the weights for in order that this matrix that we construct here converges to the manifold Laplacian. So to make sure that this operator has a limit and the limit is not biased, it's actually the operator that we want. In discrete, on graphs and other, in discrete geometry, everything that we did was very well studied. The only thing we had to do is to find the choice that actually gives us the limit. And we did. This is the work of my student Yu-Chia Chen, who essentially found a kernel that on triangles that gives us the limit that we want. And then Yu-Chia Chen with Wei Cheng Wu actually also proved the consistency, yes, including the constants, A and B. And A is 1 and B is 1 over 4. It's not here. All right. Now that we have the Laplacian as an operator, this will be a matrix again, but it's a matrix that maps from graph edges to graph edges instead of nodes to nodes, because it operates on vector fields, and the vector field on a discrete graph is a flow on the graph. Okay. And these vector fields or flows, depending on whether they're discrete or continuous, are of 3 kinds. The gradient flow, which corresponds to the down Laplacian that doesn't include triangles. The curve flow that corresponds to the up Laplacian that actually is the contribution of the triangles, and the harmonic flow, which is the null space. Here is a demonstration that the algorithm works. There are 2 competing algorithms. So this is ours in red. And as you see, this molecule is not ethanol, but it's a very similar molecule. It also generates a torus, this torus that we see here. So because it's a torus, its null space has to have dimension 2. There have to be 2 zero eigenvalues. And our algorithm discovers them, but an pre-existing algorithm is actually a brilliant paper. I encourage everybody to read and appreciate it. However, this algorithm doesn't work well, needs more data to actually converge. And that's what we see here, that at 10,000 samples, it doesn't actually estimate the manifold quite so well. And the green is basically no weighting, so not doing the consistency, just putting arbitrary weights. That also doesn't cut it. Okay. And again, we expect that because a torus, we can describe it as a generator when we talk about scalar functions, but we can also describe it as a vector fields aligned with the generators. And this is what we see here, that the torsions that we discovered in the previous part of the talk align fairly well, but not perfectly, with the basis of the vector fields that we have, the 2 core vector fields that we have. Okay. So once we have the Laplacian, as I said, we can decompose it, and we have 3 kinds of vectors. So what can we do? We can analyze vector fields on the manifold. This is like doing signal processing of various kinds, smoothing, prediction, completion, semi-supervised learning, regularization, and so on, for vector fields now. Or we can also analyze the manifold, and in particular analyze its topology. And that's done by using the harmonic space, the null space of this Laplacian. All right. This is just an example of how smoothing vector fields works on real data. And this is an example, I can come back if you'd like, again, smoothing of vector fields on real data. This is an example of regularized semi-supervised learning on manifolds. And now comes the part about the topology. So here we try to do something that has to do, is similar to spectral clustering. in the sense that this manifold is just 3 tori glued together. And there is something called prime manifold decomposition that says that there exists a decomposition into the 3 tori. And by definition of the gluing is to not add topological features. However, once I got to a torus that's a prime manifold, I can't cut the torus into 2 separate cycles. Yes, it's something that if I destroy the completed topology if I decompose it into cycles. So in some sense, these cycles in a torus are dependent, and the cycles in between tori are independent. Okay, and we know that this exists, except in dimension 4. So what do we try to do? If we have the harmonic, the null space of the Laplacian, so essentially if we find the 0 eigenvalues and look at the eigenvectors there, we have a basis for this space. And this tells us how many independent loops are in total, but not how to decompose them. But we know that their dimension. However, we also may notice that this basis that we got from our favorite eigensolver is not unique, because this is an eigenspace. All the eigenvalues are 0. And so, again, Yucha Chen noticed that there is a rotation that is, in some sense, optimal for this basis. There's a basis in some sense optimal, and that's the one that actually decomposes, does the prime manifold decomposition if it's there. And again, there is a proof that I have completely removed. And this is not so very visible here. These are the original eigenvectors, and they project onto, so this is 4 loops, so it's a 4-dimensional space. They project into these hazy blobs here. However, if I do the rotation and obtain Z, these eigenvectors are much more localized on the component, on the prime manifold component. And so you see that between 2 different manifolds, they're completely orthogonal, and within a torus, they are like a nice ellipsoid, because, as I said, it can't be decomposed. This can't be decomposed any further. Yes?
Sorry, could you explain the right figure?
Yes. So in red are the eigenfunctions from the y eigenfunctions, 2 by 2, pair plot. And in blue are the z eigenfunctions, also pair plot. And what this shows is that here there is a hint that there are 2 independent directions. Here it's clear that there are 2 independent directions. So the basis z is just a rotation of the basis y, but it's actually, in some sense, optimal. It actually decomposes the harmonic space. By the way, every dot is an edge here in this graph. Okay, now quickly the last figure probably. This is on a very simple example where there are exactly 2 independent loops. And in blue and green are the y, is the y basis, the original base, axis aligned. And as you see, it kind of likes to be localized in one place, but is not completely localized. However, if we do something very simple like independent component analysis, then the axes are rotated along with the independent components, essentially, which are also orthogonal. And then they detect, as you see, there is localization, and you can decompose the manifold based on essentially where the edges belong. So we can do something like spectral clustering, or like tease out from ICA what are the components. Yeah. All right. Moreover, there is another problem that we would like to solve, and that is the following. Now we know that in this component there is 1 cycle. But what is the cycle? And actually, this is a difficult problem because, yes, every human, even a child, would say this is the cycle. But in reality, anything that goes around the hole is a cycle. And if you are on a torus, then it can be much more complicated. And this is now called, finding a short cycle basis, not just the eigen-decomposition that maps the edges to groups, is an NP-hard problem. And it's also, even the heuristics are pretty expensive. However, now that we have something that's like ICA, we can do things, very simple things like spectral clustering, and have a much faster algorithm that actually also works well. And here are examples where, various real examples, we have also synthetic examples, where this alignment works very well and finds the real basis much better and faster than the existing algorithms. And I didn't say this, but this is on different simplicial complexes. It doesn't have to be the one that we use, because this is a more general result. So with this, I'm at the end of the talk. what interests me in this talk is manifold learning beyond the embedding algorithm, but in a more general sense, it is also explanation without visualization, basically semi-automatic explanation. And it is also bringing higher level mathematical concepts into the scientific data analysis. So from where we went, historically from manifolds represented analytically, more and more we have manifolds represented from data. So we need to handle mathematical concepts, and we need to also output results that can be explained in scientific language and not in the machine learning language, because we have explanations also in the machine learning language, but those are not scientific and maybe not even reproducible. And so this is a generic method for interpretation in the language of the domain and extending to scalar functions. So my message is that there are some commonalities between the work that will be presented here in the future and this work, and that is the preoccupation with getting generic methods to explain what our machine learning do, and methods that also can be verified quantitatively instead of relying on visualization. And that's because essentially, if we want to help scientists or humanity, we can't produce patterns and then let the users check them. Machine, just like software now is checkable, and you can't sell as, well, I don't know if you can't, but good practice is to actually have a system that, a software system that tests itself so that it's guarantees to some extent that it's debuggable, and when you publish a paper, you publish the code so that it's reproducible. Machine learning algorithms, no matter what they're doing, should also have this requirement that they come with validation algorithms that are packaged with the algorithm. So we have to design not just the algorithm, but also the validation of the algorithm. That's the high-level goal. Thank you.
Definitely have time for some questions.
Maybe a question. So in the first problem, so you want to find this, essentially this first map that's sparse and then this non-linear map. I mean, so it's nice, I really like the trick that you use of looking at linear, making it linear by looking at the derivatives. I guess the deep learning way would be to just try to train the whole thing together, right? You could just have some model that learns non-linear function and then a first linear model that has some sparsity bias, say some L1 norm on this weight, and then just try to optimize the whole thing together. It's going to be non-convex, but usually this kind of thing works, right? That's what we see in deep learning. Did you try anything like this, just trying to...
let me see if I follow the question. So you're saying that you could use this in learning, in training the neural network? Or
yeah, it would look a bit like a neural network, right? If you have one model, say a kernel method that try to learn the age, and then it's just a linear model, say with some L1 weights, L1 norm on the weights, it would kind of, optimizing both at the same time, would kind of look like a neural network.
oh, this is interesting. I haven't thought of this like learning the age itself. It actually, yes, I have not done or tried it. There are many other things about the age that we can infer from the sparsity that we can infer from the data. But indeed, this is an interesting question. It could be actually tried, especially if you have more data and not so big the dictionary. Yes. What I thought that it would be possible in a, I don't know if with guarantees or not, is to actually use the neural network representation. So the internal representation of neural network, I don't believe it's a manifold, but locally it could be something of constant dimension. And this, again, can be used also on patches. It doesn't have to be used on the whole manifold. The question is, how do you patch out? How do you cut the patches? That's the question. It's not that it can't be used on patches. So it could be that we can try to explain local regions of the neural network representation by user-defined functions. Also, I didn't say that this, if the dictionary is not complete, then it's a regression problem. The noise will be higher, but it still will work. We still detect the functions that are aligned with the manifold. So yes, I think there are connections that could be made. Yes?
So in your ManifoldLasso, how many variables do you have in that problem? It scales with the number of samples, or it doesn't? It looked like NP variables, am I right, or am I wrong?
So P is the number of functions. That's the number of variables in ManifoldLasso. Right. Let me show you. OK, so here is what you're asking. 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 this is P. This is the set of functions, the dictionary, and this is the dimension is 2 or 1 in one case.
That's the
intrinsic dimension. So we select 2 out of 750.
No, I was asking how many betas. So you have those beta J's.
I have 1 per data point and 1.
And
so
there's P,
data
P
points times times variables.
So it's NP variables, right?
Data points times variables. Yes.
And then
times coordinate. Yes. So for each coordinate, and here I have like 3 embedding coordinate.
Right.
For each data point and for each dictionary function. So D times M times N times P.
Yeah. So then this I mean, even though the problem is convex, I mean, scaling to large data sets, I mean, this will not be. You can't do this so efficiently, right?
Actually, no. This runs in like maybe fraction of a minute or second. No, this runs very fast. So what we do is we don't use all the points for the lasso. We use only like 100 points or 500 points. Yes. So it's like it's n prime instead of n. Yeah, and that's fine because we still need all the data to estimate the tangent space well. Or for other things like pulling back, we need all the data. But we do it only at selected points.
Yeah, my other question was, so you had guaranteed S hat contained in S star, right? But your algorithm is sort of, so you're searching for lambda so that, you know the cardinality of the true number of features. You're picking a lambda so that the number of active variables is equal to the number of active variables you believe is there. But your recovery guarantee is for a pre-chosen lambda, or it's for the.
The recovery guarantee is usually yes, it's for a pre-chosen lambda.
So you actually aren't guaranteed that the cardinality of S hat that you're guaranteeing is the same. So you might miss your guarantees doesn't preclude. Your guarantee says if you're non-zero, you're a true. But it doesn't say that if you're true, you're non-zero, right? It doesn't guarantee that S star is equal to S hat, right?
So assuming that D is correctly estimated, the recovery guarantees, maybe I can show you, they just say lambda greater than something. That's how the...
But the issue
yes?
is that,
so
the potential issue is that S hat may not have the right cardinality. It could be smaller, for example, right?
At that lambda.
At the lambda that you're guaranteeing, S hat could have a smaller cardinality than the number of true active variables. Like imagine think about your chemistry example. You have those 2 torsion angles, right? So it's possible at the lambda that you use, maybe S hat is only 1. So you only recover 1 of the true variables, right?
So many things can go wrong with real data, and that's not the only one. However, like real data also has noise. And we are not counting. So it's a multi-scale data set, really. And so the conditions of the theorem don't apply exactly for that data. But I don't think I have any doubts that if we actually generate a data set that satisfies this condition, then at this lambda, we'll probably find with high probability the true data set.
When you use that lambda, the cardinality actually is the right one.
I mean, this comes from the proof.
Yeah.
That says that you recover all the bases, and if the coefficients are large enough, then there'll be, you also recover the coefficient with some noise. Otherwise you basically, as you said, you can zero out some coefficients if the coefficients are very small. Yeah, that's kind of standard group lasso, or like the kind of guarantees that we get are more or less standard group lasso. But very nice questions. Are there other questions?
Still have a little time for one more question, I think. No? Well, let's thank
Thank you.